So my name's Ellen. I'm part of the Curlew Action team, and we've got 3 guest speakers here this evening to discuss Curlews and Extinction. We've got Geoff Hilton, who is Head of Conservation Evidence from WWT. We've got Matthew Goodall, who is Head of Education and Advisor to Wales and North West England from GWCT. I hope I got that right, Matt. And we've got Professor Ralph Pites, who teaches English at the University of Bristol and specialises in studies of literature and the environment, and how writing may be able to help us address and engage with the current emergency. So thank you very much to our speakers. Right, so the structure of this evening is we're going to have some short presentations from our speakers, and then we're going to have a panel discussion and a guest Q&A. So if you have any comments or questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the chat, and you'll have an opportunity to ask the speakers at the end. So we're going to kick off. So Matt, could we start with you? Do you want to give your presentation?
Let me share my screen. It'll be a second. Everybody see that? Yeah. Excellent. I don't know if you can still see me or you can just see my slides, but there you go. So good evening, everyone. Absolutely pleasure to be here with you all. I've been asked to talk about the multiple benefits of curlew conservation, of which there are many direct and indirect benefits. And kind of the reason I've been asked, I suppose, is I was one of the key authors of a paper that the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust were commissioned to write for Natural Resources Wales. So I'm based just over the border into Wales, but as you can see from my hefty job title there, I cover kind of northwest England and Wales, and also kind of spearhead our educational programme for the trust. So an introduction to the GWCT, for many that don't know, it stands for the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. This is the bump on the screen there that you can see. That's our aims, really. But in general, we're celebrating our 100th year, really, in 2030, I think it is. And our background predominantly in game bird management and specifically in grey partridges and working out why grey partridges were declining, looking at that link between herbicides and insecticides and that basically the loss of habitat, the loss of chick food and all that side of things. And then as time has passed, we've been involved in lots and lots of more things. So we have a whole fisheries department that looks at salmon and sea trout and the declines in those. We range from everywhere from a Monroe up in Scotland to a chalk stream down in southern England. And we also work in kind of sustainable regenerative farming. And we have a demonstration farm over in Leicestershire. And we try to demonstrate best practice, basically wildlife recovery wherever we can, and we research that. It's a team of predominantly scientists putting out more than 100 scientific papers a year, and we look to problem solve, really. So we look, what's the problem, we research how that problem can be solved, and then we use that research to disseminate that scientific advice to practitioners on the ground, be that farmers, be that gamekeepers, be that any land manager, be that policymakers, politicians and the likes, really, to try and get a British countryside that's as diverse and thriving as possible, really. So that's a very kind of brief history of the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. And then myself, I've worked for the trust now for 6 years, I think. I was a practicing ecologist before that, always been a keen birder, and my kind of route in to curlew specifically, I suppose, was more down the predation management side of it, in terms of training the gamekeeping community in best practice predation management and looking at the benefits of that, but not solely that. Like I said, I've always been a keen birder, and I'm just keen to explore ways in which we can increase biodiversity in whatever way that might be. So whether it's through finding ways of getting farming, profitable farming, productive farming alongside wildlife recovery is a real key issue, I think. We can't have nature reserves everywhere, so that's one of our kind of key areas, I think. If you look at something like 72% of the UK is farmed, how do we produce food for an ever-growing human population alongside also producing wildlife, if you like? So the view on that, in a way, is to try and produce wildlife as efficiently as we can with the land that we can. So that's a very brief introduction to me and the GWC team. I sit on a group which is, you'll all be familiar with, the Curlew Recovery Partnership, which Curlew Action is part of, and then also Curlew Action, although I did notice before it's not on this list of groups that are involved in Wales. I sit on a group called Gilfyn Cymru, which is essentially translated into Curlew Wales, or Wales Curlew. And it's a multi-organisational group, as you can see there from all the organisational kind of banners there that are included in this, ranging from ourselves to the RSPB, to NRW, to BTO, to the farming unions, all coming together to try and work together for the benefit of Curlew. As part of that group in 2021, that group formed in 2018. And then as part of that group, we were tasked by Welsh Government to come up with an action plan for curlew recovery, which we produced in 2021. And that was a 10-year plan, so from 2021 to 2031. And the reason being, you'll all be familiar with declines in curlew across Britain. In Wales, it's, real dire straits. There's been a study that the BTO put out which modelled curlew decline in Wales and found that if the status quo remains, curlew will be extinct as a breeding bird, or likely to be extinct as a breeding bird in Wales by as soon as 2033. So less than 9 years away now. So it's really devastating news, but a real kind of kick up the bum, hopefully, as well, to politicians, to policymakers, and to everyone on the ground, really, to try and do the best that we can to solve this equation, which is really problematic when it comes to curlew conservation, as it's so complicated. Then, as part of that Curlew Recovery Action Plan, NRW commissioned a multiple benefits paper, and the reason behind that is that Welsh Government looked to provide funding for multi-species recovery. So when we were asking for funding just for curlew and to solve the kind of curlew problem, as I was saying a minute ago, we were finding that we were knocking on closed doors, and just because of the funding streams and the conduit for that funding kind of wouldn't allow things that weren't multiple species. So NRW commissioned this report to look at, if you have a focus on conserving curlew, what are the multiple benefits from that, and what's your your bang for your buck, your value for money. So we commissioned, we did that report. That was published in 2023, although I think it was pretty much finished back in 2022. It took a while to get published, and we looked at these kind of four key questions. We wanted to know what extent were curlew supported by Welsh legislation and policy, which is the one area that I won't be covering in this kind of quick presentation, because it's the boring part, really. The second was, what are the biodiversity benefits, which with specific reference to species of conservation concern. And then we also looked at the cultural significance and the well-being and societal benefits of curlew, which I'm sure everyone on this call will be really familiar with. And then we also looked at ecosystem services derived from land management practices associated with curlew conservation. So the whole suite, really. So I think I was given kind of 5 to 7 minutes just to cover this, and then I'll answer questions on it. So the kind of key headlines, if you like, in terms of biodiversity, the things that were obvious is that good breeding and feeding curlew habitats are normally associated with heterogeneous landscape structures, so diverse landscapes and diverse habitats within those landscapes. And those habitats are then also positively correlated with greater diversity of plants, insects and birds. So we found that more than 84 species of different taxonomic groups benefit directly or indirectly from conservation targeted at curlew. So that could be anything from a kestrel or barn owl to a brown-banded carder bee. There's all sorts of things. that list included 20 box species, so birds of conservation concern, which is a specific, there's obviously a UK box list, but Wales has its own specific one. So that was really key. So 20 red and amber listed bird species were beneficiaries of conservation work targeted at curlew recovery. And then I said about the boring bit being the legislation. The Environment Wales Act 2016 has a list of what's called Section 7 species, which are those species which the ministers in Wales were deemed to have a responsibility to try and maintain their biodiversity. So it includes things like water voles, brown hares, hen harriers, black grouse, all sorts of things. And that list of 84 species that benefit from curlew conservation also included 26 of those Section 7 species, ranging from birds, reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates. So in terms of trying to find, value for money and focusing on curlew as the driver, we certainly felt like we found that, and this was done through a review of scientific literature. We didn't we didn't create anything new. We pulled together all the information which was out there, so it was a desktop study, and I don't think anything like that had been done before for any species that I can think of, but certainly not for curlew. So it was a very good resource for kind of policymakers to be aware of. And we produced, I didn't want to kind of go through it in too much detail, but we produced diagrams like this. That bit there shouldn't be on there, but the diagram description automatically generated shouldn't be on there. But you can see there, from if we look at in the lowlands as an example, grassland management specifically for curlew, if we look at fewer grass cuts, you normally get that diverse sward structure. You then can get either invertebrate abundance and diversity, or invertebrate accessibility, which can help increase chick survival, which means then that you can get more waders. As a very simple looking at one line of that, but you can see how complicated that becomes as you look across the different areas of that. The cultural significance. Again, as I said before, many of you on this call will be more than familiar with the well-being side of curlew, and we're all on this call because we want to see curlew in the future, and certainly that's a driver for me. And I've got 2 young daughters. I'm desperate for them to see and hear curlew in the future. That's one of the things that really drives me, as well as other species like lapwing and so on. So, but with curlew specifically, you'll be aware of them as being known as the herald of spring, and that beautiful kind of daunting call, which we were talking before everyone joined in, and we were saying we haven't had anyone do an impression of a curlew yet, but there's always a first. So if any of you want to have a go, maybe we could make this happen, but it certainly won't be me. We know that curlew are frequently referenced throughout Welsh history, theology, literature, arts and heritage. St Brenno is strongly linked with Wales. There's an awful lot of reference to curlew within Welsh literature, and we did a very quick survey out to which the farming unions put out to their members. So it was aimed at farmers and land managers really, and we found from that overwhelming support. So some of the key things from that was that 95% of respondents agreed that curlew were an important species of the culture and heritage and hold an important place in our hearts and minds. Again, 95% of respondents thought that it would be right for Welsh Government to prioritise conservation funds for curlew, given that proposed or potential local extinction in Wales as a breeding bird by 2033. And also 95% of respondents thought that other species may benefit from targeted curlew recovery. And within that, we had a list, and things like lapwing and golden plover came up, and redshank and species like that were ones without those respondents having any form of kind of scientific teachings, or they were not to kind of lump everyone in with the same group, but they were just your kind of average Joe, but they all responded thinking that, yeah, you can see that link there. If you're doing curlew conservation, you've got nice habitat for curlew, there's lots of species that are going to benefit, and in that way we can use curlew, although we have to be careful of using indicator species. We can certainly use curlew as an indicator of how healthy that habitat and that environment is. This comes from Curlew country, as you can see there, who I'm hoping some of you will be familiar with. It's based in Shropshire and the Welsh Marches. They're an organisation closely linked with the GWCT, and they've been doing curlew conservation for many years now, and kind of key in looking at that link with getting groups of farmers together and looking at the benefits of that. So they've done everything from head starting to choir meetings and all sorts of things and everything in between. So you can see there again another kind of infographic on how everything is linked, from the curlew being the main point of focus to increased tourism, to wider environmental benefits, to school children in urban communities, farmers on the land, wider conservation. It's a real kind of key part of that jigsaw, or it can be. And then just to finish on this one, we looked at the key kind of ecosystem services, so things that curlews can provide, which is going to benefit the everyday human. So it could be things like water quality, it could be soil quality, it could be increased pollinators, and as you can see there, certainly when you've got good quality curlew habitat, so if you think of lowland, kind of wetland grasslands, diverse grasslands, good for pollinators, increased populations of pollinators with that. We use curlew, if you like, and the conservation measures for curlew. What we want to do is we want to get soil to be in as healthy a state as it can, to have lots of worms and things like that in there. So it needs to be good probable soil, which is also means once you manage soil for those qualities, it means you get more organic content. It's a better sponge, so it soaks up more water, it sequesters more carbon. Grassland diversity goes without saying. The water quality is an interesting one. So again, more diverse or good quality soil alongside good diverse grasslands can mean that you're using less kind of artificial nitrogen in the way that you're managing that ground. That less then means that you've got less eutrophication of rivers and so on. So you've got improved water quality there. And then there's indirect delivery of financial gain. So deeper rooting, more diverse grasslands can improve carbon sequestration. They can also do that because they're being disturbed less. So every time that you disturb a grassland, so if you've got a temporary grass lay that's needing sowing every 5 years, you're disturbing the soil, you're releasing carbon every time you do that. With a permanent kind of less intensive grassland, you're actually sequestering more carbon in the long run doing that. And then this whole thing with organic matter, there's this belief that kind of a 2% increase in organic matter can store, I can't remember how many tons of water it is now, but it's an awful lot more water, and that means that there's less flooding then downstream, and that's also then got financial benefits to it as well. So this paper pulled all of those together, so that the socio-economic and biodiversity benefits of just focusing on curlew management. So it's not saying that curlew delivers all of these things magically, but what is clear from this is getting groups of land managers, so farmers being the main ones, all together, giving them the interest in one particular species, although it could be a group of species, and using that as the driver to deliver conservation gains, really. And we see it time and time again with not only curlew but with different species. The trust that I work for, the GWCT, has done some phenomenal things with lapwing as well down in the Avon Valley, and just showing farmers lapwing chicks can be that, it makes it all worthwhile to them. That's why they're doing that conservation measure. They can see that it doesn't have to always have a financial gain, but through a paper like this, we can use this kind of paper to target policymakers developing agri-environment schemes to say, look, this prescription might be slightly more expensive than that other prescription, but it gives you all of these extra benefits by just focusing on curlew, as it were. So that's a very quick introduction to what I'll be answering questions on, and I'll pass you back to Ellen now.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was a really great overview on the wider significance of curlew conservation. It was really, really interesting, and I've got loads of questions, and we will dive a lot deeper into that during the panel discussion. So thank you. Geoff, would you like to go next?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much to Curlew Action for asking me to get involved tonight. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the slender-billed Curlew. And this is one of the species of Curlew that we have probably, and I'll come back to the probably bit, probably lost in recent years from the world. There are none in captivity. If it's gone, it's gone. And I put mostly forgotten because I think rather unlike the Eurasian Curlew, the slender-billed Curlew has gone out with something of a whimper, not a bang. And it's interesting and a bit sad, at least to people like me. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the slender-billed Curlew, what it was and where it was. So it was a bird that bred somewhere in that kind of bluey green blob over there in Central Asia. And you can see one of the main things is that's a very big blob. Actually, only one breeding site was ever found in history. It was in southern Russia, just near the Kazakh border in the 1920s. Other than that, they were kind of, it's all anecdote, report, whatever. Its breeding range has never been pinned down. Again, I'll come back to that. The reason it was quite well known to Europeans was because it used to spend the winter. It had this very strange east-west migration and wintered in the Mediterranean basin, particularly in places like Morocco and Italy, and some places further east into North Africa. We think there might have been another population wintering sort of down in the Middle East, possibly in the sort of Kuwait, the sort of Iraq marshes area, possibly down into Yemen. But that and that population would have migrated down the east side of the Caspian Sea. But to be honest, we don't actually know if it ever was there or if it was a few random sightings or what. So it was always a fairly obscure bird, but not a particularly rare bird, actually, quite numerous back in the 19th century. So what happened? Well, it started to decline in the second half, the final quarter, really, of the 1800s, and it went down very quickly. And it was a rare bird by fairly early in the 20th century, but it carried on, and there's a reason for that. As many of you know, curlews are long-lived birds, so even a population on its last legs will carry on without going completely extinct for quite a while. And so actually when the last sighting was is kind of hotly debated. This is not an easy bird to identify, particularly, at least many of them aren't. As you can see, it looks a bit like a curlew and like a whimbrel. And so once you've got a bird this rare and people desperate to see one, then you get some pretty controversial, was it not, sightings. The last group that sort of pretty much everyone is convinced, and it was a group, not an individual, was at Merja Zerga in Morocco in 1995. This was a wintering flock that went there every year, got smaller and smaller, and one year didn't reappear. And ever since then, there have been some sightings, but none of them are universally agreed to have been an actual slender-billed curlew. So what went wrong? Well, we don't really know exactly because it was a long time ago, but we're fairly confident that overhunting was a really important part of the problem. Overhunting of these birds that came to the Mediterranean for the winter. And there's all sorts of stories about how in mixed flocks of wading birds, mixed flocks of curlew species, the slender-bills would be the one at the back, didn't spot the hunter, didn't get out of the way, and so they got incredibly high shooting pressure, even though the hunters were particularly aiming for them, because they were a bit dopey. And of course, one of the problems there is if they keep hooking onto other flocks of waders when they get really rare, they carry on getting shot because they're still with a big flock of waders attracting hunters, and they're still the dopey ones in the flock. So that was probably the single biggest problem. The middle picture is one of my photos, actually, from the Kazakh steppe. In the distance, you've got the Altai Mountains. Under, well, late 19th century onwards, particularly under Stalin, huge swathes of the steppe were ploughed up. And this may well have lost slender-billed curlew most of its breeding habitat. And on the right is a picture of actually a Rocky Mountain locust. Now, you may have heard of the Eskimo Curlew. This is a North American curlew species, which is also probably extinct, hasn't been seen for a few decades. And that was also overhunted and declined from being incredibly abundant to extinct. They used to shoot a couple of million a year in the late 19th century, so it's not surprising it took a bit of a hit. But one of the things that happened to that species on spring migration, they used to eat this unbelievably abundant locust that lived on the sort of prairies on the edge of the Rocky Mountains. And so all their staging sites were predicated on, there's going to be a shed load of locust to eat when we get there. And the Rocky Mountain locust is now globally extinct. It's gone. That's why that's a picture of one with a pin on. We managed to plough up so many of the steppes and also have lots of pesticides and whatever to get rid of locusts that we made the locust go extinct. And the Eskimo Curlew quite likely was, one of the final nails in the coffin was the loss of this critical spring stopover food. It's a remarkable story. There is a bit of speculation that something similar might have happened to Slender-billed Curlews. They also would have had stopover sites in the steppe. Was there some grasshopper, super abundant grasshopper locust type species that they lost? Very, very speculative, but it's an intriguing, if slightly moot point. So what happened? So we got to about the 2000s, and the last flock in Morocco had gone. And basically, suddenly the conservation board go, hang on a minute, there is nowhere to even try to save Slender-billed Curlews because we don't know where any of them are, literally none of them. And so a few efforts were made to see if we could track them down. This is, again, one of my pictures. One of the things I actually did this work while working for RSPB. We had a bit of a search for Slender-billed Curlews using molecular techniques, but it did involve some interesting thousands of miles driven across the steppe and the semi-desert in Kazakhstan and colleagues in Russia, with local colleagues looking for waders and seeing if there are any Slender-billed Curlews around. So that's one of my photos from the middle of the Kazakh steppe, and it was extraordinary. We once drove 140 miles without seeing a person, a road, or a dwelling. It was quite a life-changing experience. There's a lot of space out there. And what we ended up with was this really clever scientific paper, which used this molecular technique, stabilized techniques on museum skins of Slender-billed Curlews to try to narrow down where did it breed, in case we could narrow down the search. Because at the time, people were saying, well, it might live in the boreal forest, in bogs in the boreal forest, or it might live in the desert, or it might live anywhere in between, in the steppe, in the semi-desert, in the forest steppe. And so there's kind of huge latitudinal range where it could be. So we thought we could narrow it down with these molecular techniques, and we kind of did, and we wrote a nice paper. By the time we'd done all the work and written the paper, the bird was probably extinct. It may well have gone extinct while we were doing the work, which is a salutary thought. I have probably seen more Slender-billed Curlews than anyone else alive today, but I've never seen a live one. I've been all around the museums of Europe looking at the skins of 19th century Slender-bills and getting feathers off them and sticking them in a mass spectrometer. Again, it's a slightly sad experience and a little bit surreal, really. So about in the late noughties, a bunch of us at RSPB decided that if the Slender-billed Curlew was going to go, it might as well go down with a bit of a fight. So we organised something called a last push to see if we could find one. And a colleague of mine, I can't take any credit for this, a colleague of mine, Nicola Crockford, picked this up, and my God, she ran with it. So she had these sort of leaflets made about this is what a Slender-billed Curlew is, this is what they look like, contacted every ornithologist from Western Morocco to Kazakhstan, translated this leaflet into N different languages, and organised loads of expeditions over winter of local people to go and look for Slender-bills in potential sites. Almost all of them unpaid, with a few exceptions where small grants were given. They did it because there was a big publicity. Come on, let's have one last go, see if we can find some. And actually at the time we had decided we would have a flying squad, which was ready to fly out anywhere in that region at the drop of a hat, and probably attempt to capture one and put a satellite tag on it, because if we can't find where they breed or where they winter, then it's all over. So even despite the risk, and I remember sort of going into work 1 or 2 days when there was a possible sighting, and you make sure you bring your passport in, Geoff, and we'd got the kit ready, and there's a day when we thought, I think we are actually flying to Uzbekistan today, and then no, stand down, they're just wind rules. So it was all a bit sad, because basically it kind of led to nothing. So is it extinct? Nobody knows is the true answer. Do I think it's extinct? Yes, but I'm certainly not sure. And there's plenty of examples in history of stuff coming back from apparently beyond the grave. I've also worked on a duck. Don't hold it against it that it's a duck called the Madagascar pochard, which has twice been declared officially extinct on the red list and twice been rediscovered. and is now doing, moderately well actually in Madagascar. So, these things do happen. And there is a thing which I love the name, it's a rather sad idea, but the Romeo error, which is a conservation biology term for if you give up on a species too early before it's really gone, you can cause its extinction by giving up on it, which obviously a reference to Romeo and Juliet. And that is the thing we're very keen to avoid with Slender-billed Curlew. So don't make it officially extinct in case people stop looking. So I thought I'd end with, I've mentioned Madagascar potchard as a sort of little draft of hope. This is a sociable lapwing, and it's a photo again I took on my trips in Kazakhstan. At the time I was in Kazakhstan, sociable lapwing were the next on extinction taxi rank. They were down to 200 pairs, we thought, and going down at a hell of a rate with 200 pairs left in the world, scattered across the Kazakh steppes. And I was pitching my tent one evening in the back end of nowhere, as I've said, and got my telescope out and had a little squint around the area, and there was a colony of sociable lapwings. And I was thinking, well, if there's 200 pairs left, I am the luckiest man in the world, because this is a steppe the size of Europe, and I've just found a group of them by my tent. A couple of days later, found another little colony, went back to Britain, said, guys, there's something wrong here, right? They can't be as rare as we thought, or I'm just cosmically lucky. And we managed to get some satellite tags on them the next year. The bird duly migrated with the satellite tag. We discovered it was in, well, firstly southeastern Turkey, and then it went to, I can't remember if it was Oman or Yemen. Anyway, we rang up the Ministry of the Environment. The guy went out there and said, I've just seen 3,000 of them. And it turns out sociable lapwings were nowhere near as rare as we thought. They were in trouble. They were declining. But until you start looking really, really hard, when you start looking really, really hard, sometimes things turn out not to be quite as bad. Sociable lapwing was still on the way out, but sociable lapwing had more time and we had more opportunity to save it than we thought. Yeah, even when looking for a species that turns out to be a little possibly extinct, you can get some blasts of good luck that take you somewhere else. So that's it from me. Back to you, Ellen. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Geoff. That was really, really interesting. And oh my goodness, that last push stuff, that must have been a complete emotional roller coaster. Yeah, I can only imagine. And thank you for including that story about the sociable lapwing. It's really nice to hear that little bit of hope. And yeah, let's hope we just get lucky again with the Slender-bill. You never know. Wouldn't that be an exciting phone call to get? Ralph, over to you.
Great. Okay, so as Ellen said, I'm slightly to one side of this because I teach English literature at the University of Bristol. I'm sorry if there's some background noise. My office is being repainted this week, so I'm in a slightly social space, so I hope you can all hear me. And in my world, where we teach and try and help students to start thinking about the environmental crisis through literature, we tend not to spend so much time thinking about particular species. It's kind of not very fashionable. I think people kind of have the idea that, you know, caring about polar bears is a bit for 8-year-olds, and there are lots of kind of problematic consequences of focusing exclusively on single species or on what are called charismatic megafauna. So we tend to talk more about global justice, or the Anthropocene, or we think about the ways in which the environmental crisis is so intersectional that it kind of comes out of all sorts of different things at once. Population growth, consumerism, capitalism, globalization, etc., being parts of the factors which lead to these extinctions which we so regret. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today is not specifically about curlews, but more to do with saying, okay, so what's the value of focusing on a single species? What do we learn from that? What does it tell us about our relationship to the planet and our ways of being in the world? And secondly, what can the study of literature from the present and from the past do to help us to understand the value of species, to help us to look at a particular species? So my question is, what's in a species? And what you have in front of you is Stan the kestrel, who I'll come back to later on, but one of the consequences of thinking like this is that you tend to change your teaching a bit. And we were doing some work on books you may have heard of, H is for Hawk and J.A. Baker's The Peregrine. And we realized that the students had never seen a bird of prey. They didn't really know what we were talking about. So we asked a local hawker to come in, and he brought in a kestrel and a peregrine. And this is Stan the kestrel. And the effect of that presence of the bird to the students in the room was completely extraordinary. Enviable, really, for a teacher, because, you know, that bird commanded the students' attention in a way that I never could. I'll come back to that in a minute. But that's the kind of world we're in, I think. So I wanted to give a few examples of not curlews, but other plants and animals which are currently at risk. And the first one I came across is a plant called crested cowweed, which I came across on the Woodland Trust website, and it said this is an endangered plant. It gave details of where it grows, why it's declining, and so on. And so I looked up cowweed on a poetry database, and this poem came up from the 1830s. The southern wood to pay your care, more likely if you follow there the spiky whirls of cowweed dressed, with gold and purple mingled crest. Or springing from the root-heaved ground, that parasitic stranger found within the pine or beechwood shade, the yellow bird's nest, through the glade, breathing from many a ripened bell the vernal primrosed fragrant smell. So what happens when you know about cowweed and you read this poem? Well, the first thing I think you notice is that this writer has looked very carefully at the flower, the spiky whirls of cowweed dressed with gold and purple mingled crest, exactly identifying the qualities, the visual qualities of that flower. I've recently got a couple of apps for my phone. One is called Flora Incognita, and the other one is the Merlin app to listen to birdsong, which I'm sure many of you know already. But it's using these for the last year has shown me that identifying the particular species really opens your eyes to the world around you. So this focus on identification, on the particularity of particular forms of life, has this ability to open up your awareness to not nature as a whole, or nature as a set of problems, but nature as specific forms of life all around us. And that's what the poet is helping us to see, isn't it? Because describing the cowweed, and then what's called the bird's nest orchid, which is a parasitic plant which grows on wood and produces, well, he says the vernal primrose fragrant smell. The Woodland Trust tells me actually it smells like rotting meat, and this is a way of attracting attracting flies to help it pollinate. So the first point to raise about this is that if you start looking like this person does at specific forms of life, specific species, then you start to see their particularity with new clarity. You see, I think, also their uniqueness. There's nothing like the crested cowweed. There's nothing like the slender-billed curlew. And now here's Norman Nicholson, who's a wonderful poet from Cumbria, in his poem, The Holy Mountain, where again, he talks about all of the flowers that he sees, and he includes in this cowweed. And the flowers of the dale, bigger than those of the fells, frailer than those of the fields. The globe flower, like a lemon, quartered but unpeeled. The bellflower, hanging its blue chime from a steeple of nettle leaves. Betony and cowwheat, goldenrod and touch-me-not. And in the wood, enchanter's nightshade, and by the river, daffodils. Now I'd connect that with what Matthew was talking about. Because one of the things that Matthew points out in those amazing infographics, and in the way that conserving a curlew has all sorts of ecosystem, what that tells us is that all species are unique, and all species are totally entwined within a system of interrelationships. That if you look after the curlew, everything else profits. If you take out the curlew, everything suffers. And here's a flower. He's talking about the Holy Mountain. He's talking about the different flowers of the dale. And there they all are together. The globe flower, the bellflower, betony, cowweed, goldenrod, and touch-me-not. And his language captures and focuses on each of them in turn. He writes a list. And when he's describing some of them, he describes them with great anatomical, well, kind of botanical, but also metaphorical detail. The globe flower is like a lemon, quartered but unpeeled. You see exactly what he means by that, and it's an exact representation of the flower. And the bellflower hanging its blue chime. But these are also seen by the poet within a complex, interdependent ecosystem. And you're getting ecosystemic understanding of the natural world from writers. And you're also seeing that combined with the sense that a particular species is one thing. Because the other thing that comes out of this, I think if you start looking at particular species and you understand that they're interrelated and they're unique, sometimes you start to see the world with a kind of astonishment. I think that identification of species, focusing on particular species, doesn't isolate them. It doesn't kind of create polar bears without any reference to their world they live in. It actually starts to make you grasp the world as an extraordinary complex of intertwined species, to the extent that sometimes it kind of boggles your mind. And the 18th century poet Christopher Smart, who wrote these amazing poems in Jubilate Agno, kind of was thought to be mad at the time, and he was incarcerated for madness. And his poems are very, very strange. And they're full of biblical references. He was a clergyman. They're kind of bizarre, and you don't quite know what to do with them, looking back at them from 200 years later. But what I get from them is the sense that if you look very carefully, as he does, at moon trefoil or hear cowweed, let Netafar rejoice with cowweed, for N is novelty, and therefore he is gone. I don't know what that means. I'm a professor of English. Don't know what that means. But what I do get from it is that he's sort of overpowered by the wondrous and extraordinary nature of the world around him, to the point where it kind of defeats language. You can barely say how complex and amazing things are. So the first thing I'd say about looking at species is that it goes to identification. It goes from identification to a sense of interdependence, and it goes from interdependence to a sense of some overwhelming wonder about the world. But there's another thing, I think, and this takes us back to the hawfinch, which is, again, an endangered bird, quite rare now, on the brink of going out. And the contemporary poet Neil Curry writes about the hawfinch in his poem 5 Spring Mornings. A new green mist over the black fields, as warm breath does a mirror. A hawfinch in a hawthorn could shock us all into sudden leaf. I think that's really wonderful. And I think the reason it's wonderful is that when you think about nature in the round and you worry about statistics and you think about it conceptually, you can start to forget that the natural world is made up of others. These birds they're not just species. That bird is a being. The poem, the writers I've been reading most recently are people like W.H. Hudson and Edward Thomas from the end of the 19th century. Amazing nature writers. And they keep on saying animals are persons. They don't say they're equivalent to human beings, but they say that they're kind of identities. They're not people exactly, but they are equivalent to us in their personhood. And that seems to me, I think the point here is that the hawfinch, then seen as a person, seen as kind of an equivalent to a person, creates between you and it a sense of relationship and a sense of kinship. Not just that we're all part of a system, which is a sort of ecological concept you can grasp in the abstract, but you start to see yourself within a relation of kinship with these other animals. And I think that that line, a hawfinch in a hawthorn could shock us all into sudden leaf, sort of just suggests that actually you see it and it makes a difference to you. When Matthew was talking about the government saying, well, what are the benefits to the other species? I was saying, well, what about humans as one of those species? Of course, having curlews around is going to benefit us. Why do we say that there are species over there and there are humans over here? I mean, we're a species. We're quite a nuisance species, but that's an important sense that you get from looking at animals specifically, is that there's a relationship with a person, with another out there, and you're suddenly sense of yourself as not in nature in the abstract, but amidst a crowd of others, other species, other kinds. And I think that's part of, just to finish, that's what happened when we brought the bird into the room. There was both the sense on the right-hand picture of wonder at this amazing animal, which they're brought up close to and saw in all of its extraordinary beauty. But also they saw the bird and the person in a kind of relationship, which wasn't that of a pet owner. The man was very clear that they weren't pets, that they were still wild, but there was nonetheless a relationship going on between him and that particular bird. So I think that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Ralph. I think, yeah, you made some really, really good and important points there about acknowledging that kind of awe and wonder, and that sense that these creatures are not just statistics that are declining, they're other beings that we're losing. I think that just brings a whole new perspective into this topic of extinction. And sorry, everybody, that was actually very bad chairing from me, because I let the speakers go on for ages, but you were all really, really interesting. So I just let it go on. But Ralph, what you were saying there about the value of focusing on a single species actually kind of leads in quite nicely to my first question for Matt. So Matt, in your talk, you said that we've potentially got 9 years left for curlews in Wales, which is quite scary. And we've also kind of acknowledged that curlews are a very iconic species. They evoke really strong emotions in people. And you, as you showed us earlier, they're really an important kind of umbrella for protecting lots of other species as well. Do you think if we got to that scenario in 9 years' time that we lose the curlew in Wales, do you think those other species are going to be under greater threat because of the loss of the curlew?
The simple answer is yes. There's two main kind of thought process I would have with that. The first is talking about, like you were saying before, the umbrella species, and curlew as an indicator of a good quality habitat, in that if that habitat is suboptimal, then they're one of the first species that we could see suffer, or that we think they're one of the first species in that setting that would suffer the most. So they would be, if we were to lose them, I suppose it would be almost it would highlight that habitat was suboptimal, and that we're likely to then also start losing other species as well. But then I also think, as I mentioned before, in terms of a species that can be used to drive conservation, it takes away potentially some of the motivation to conserve a certain area of habitat. If you've got a farmer who absolutely loves their curlews, has been has restored a hay meadow as an example, does all the things that we recommend in terms of electric fencing nests off, or could be trying to have a damp grassland as a foraging area, or could be predation management. They're doing everything they can do, but because curlew is a landscape bird, they will not just use one person's farm, they will use multiple farms across the landscape, flying from one side of the valley to another, nesting here, feeding over there, and so on. And then if they were to lose them there, because of no one else has joined in their fight, if you like, I think then it's I think we all feel it sometimes. It's quite defeatist, isn't it? In terms of, you've tried your hardest, yet you've lost them anyway. So almost, what's the point? Or what else have we lost? So I think that on two fronts there, that the loss of curlew, specifically in Wales within a 9-year time frame, as we were discussing, could be severely detrimental to lots of other species, and will probably be that kind of open door for us to, or the open window to look through to say, well, if they've gone, then it's likely that X, Y, and Z will also have gone, or will be soon to go next. Yeah. Okay,
so there's quite a lot hanging on the future of the curlews there. It's not just about one species. Thank you for that. Geoff, Can you see a future where we're going to end up having to go on expeditions to try and find the last Eurasian curlew? Do you think we're going to lose the Eurasian curlew in the UK?
The short answer, Ellen, is no, I don't. And I think, I mean, I'll put it another way, not on our watch. So, you know, I've been involved in curlew conservation for, I guess, 7 or so years. What is so striking is the degree of mobilization, the degree of passion. It is unprecedented, right? In you know, I've been conservation professional for 25 years. That's why I look so old. What the curlew has done is remarkable, and there is too much love out there for curlews to let them go extinct. And I always think back. I know this sounds really, it's going to sound really surreal. When I was a kid in my geography class, my head of geography stood up and did a big lesson about agriculture, and he said, if you wanted, you could grow bananas at the North Pole. And I remember thinking, what is he on about? And his point was, you know, humans are technically capable of doing almost anything. The reason we don't grow bananas at the North Pole is not because it's impossible, it's because it would be stupidly expensive for no good reason. And it took me about 20 years to realize that's what he was saying. But to me, the point is we can save any species we want if we choose as a species to do so. It is not technically impossible. You know, I know it's a hideous cliche, but we can put people on the moon. So a lot of people have asked me that question, you know, can we save them? Are they doomed really? Are we wasting our time? No, we're not. We're wasting our time if we don't do it properly and if we don't put enough into it and we don't do it well. But it's simply not true to say that we can't. We choose to, or we don't choose to. And I think, you know, I think we have kind of chosen that no, we're not going to let the curlew go. I suppose the caveat there is there's been a shed load of mobilization, there's been a shed load of passion, there's been a shed load of meetings, there's been a shed load of research. The action isn't working yet. You know, we are not turning around curlew numbers yet. So I mean, that's a pretty big problem. But we can, and I mean, and deep down in my heart of hearts, I think we will. Yeah, I think we probably lose quite a lot. I don't think we're going to end up with 50,000 pairs. I don't think we're going to end up with the range we currently have. But I don't think we're going to lose them. No.
Okay, that's encouraging to hear, because that's, I mean, I obviously don't have the experience that you do, but I agree. I don't think we're going to lose them, and maybe that's me being a naively optimistic 26-year-old. But I quite often hear these things about like nature's declining, but I'm like, oh no, it's okay. We can fix it. It's going to be fine. Okay, so I wanted to talk a bit more, Ralph, about this kind of cultural significance of curlews and nature. Obviously, curlews feature quite a lot in various sort of poems and stories. While we're on the topic of extinction, I'm really interested to know, are there any kind of words or phrases or things that people used to say that were inspired by nature that now we maybe can't use because they don't fit into our modern world? And I now actually can't see you on my screen, Ralph, so I really hope you're actually still there. And if you're not, that's also fine, because I can go into a cultural question towards Matt, because Matt, you mentioned in your presentation that there's a huge amount of public support for curlews in Wales. What would it mean culturally if we were to lose them in Wales? Oh no, Ralph is still here. Sorry, hold that thought, Matt. Ralph.
Hello. Sorry, I had to duck out of the meeting then to take a phone call. Do you want me to answer Mary's question?
Well, so I had a question about words and phrases and things that were inspired by nature that people used to say that maybe don't make sense in today's kind of modern world because of declining species or extinction.
Yeah, well, there'd be lots you could choose. I mean, the one that worries me at the moment is one swallow doesn't make a summer, which used to mean that one swallow doesn't make a summer because there'll be lots more coming. You know, the first one isn't the end of the process. It might just be a harbinger, or, you know, so don't trust first impressions. But now it kind of has this other kind of rather eerie feeling for me that one swallow doesn't make a summer because it's the only one, or it might be one of very few. So the phrase is sort of starting to change and become elegiac for me, becoming sort of a really sorrowful phrase, because it starts to echo that sense that these numbers are declining. And I think, yeah, that would be the one which is present in my mind at the moment as an example of the language kind of not being able, in order to kind of confront the changing environmental situation, the language is sort of getting twisted and starting to mean different things from what it originally meant.
That's yeah, I think that brings in a whole new kind of level to extinction and biodiversity loss, like looking at it from that sort of inspiration and literature and cultural stuff. I think it just adds a whole other thing that we're losing, and phrases like that kind of timestamp extinction and biodiversity decline in a way that statistics kind of they do, but not in the same emotional way. Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, this is partly the question that Mary's raising also about what can the arts do here, is that I feel if you in the educational space that people suffer from overwhelm and eco-anxiety, and teachers are really anxious about, sorry, that's another form of eco-anxiety, but actually to bring this, people are really struggling to find ways of bringing this into the classroom without terrifying people or without switching people off or creating apathy or despair. And I think I've got two responses to that, really. One is that telling people scientific facts, true as they are and important as those things are to know, don't actually prompt people to conservation action. If they, in some ways, they do the opposite. They kind of turn people off. On the other hand, the kind of thing I've been talking about, where you actually use writing or the opportunity to be creative in your response, to get people to draw, to get people to take photographs, kind of in conjunction with looking at nature. So rather than just sort of looking at nature, oh, it's a tree, you actually look at it very closely and start to think about the shape of its leaves, or draw the shape of its leaves, or think, what do the shape of those leaves look like? Oh, they look like fingers, or they look like webbed feet, or, you know, all sorts of things start to work then in the pupil, in the student's mind, in the observer's mind, which creates affection, creates a sense of relationship, the kind of thing I've been talking about. And that's the contribution that art can make. I think that was part of what I was trying to say about identifying, which seems like a very scientific activity. Oh, it's a slender-billed curlew, or it's a curlew, or it's a whimbrel. Might seem very scientific and dry, but actually it's part of the process of bringing people closer to an appreciation of, a sense of value, a sense of delight in, a sense of amazement at the things which we're surrounded by. And it's out of that then conservation impulses start to grow. It'd be interesting to know how, from my point of view, how Matt and Geoff got into this. Was it by reading poetry? Well, I doubt it was, but live in hope. Matt and Geoff, do you want to quickly answer that one?
So I could shock you there, but no, mine wasn't poetry. Birds for me, I can just remember being just overwhelmed by seeing lapwing and hearing lapwing for the first time when I was younger. And then still kind of fond memories of even just seeing a buzzard soaring and the sun catching underneath its wing and lighting the colour up and things like that. So that kind of just joy for the natural world and of being surrounded by it, I suppose, would be for me. So the visuals. But I do completely agree with everything you've said, Ralph. I think a lot of the time, especially my organisation and a lot of its scientific papers and research and things like that, and disseminating that and showing graphs, a lot of the time we're talking, preaching to the converted, but even that room full where they're on board and everything else, showing them lots of graphs and things, you can see sometimes people's heads starting to drop and things like this. Whereas your mention there of one swallow doesn't make a summer, it gave me goosebumps straight away. And some of the poetry that you were talking about before, and you can just see how the arts are so important in this argument, and we can't lose view of that, really. And especially, I think, with Ellen, you were going to ask me the next question, but I think enthusing children and getting children involved in this, and that's the way to do it, is so important.
I mean, I guess also, not for me, my story is divorced parents. Geoff, you're the youngest, you're walking the dog because your parents can't anymore, walking the dog on the disused railway line and thinking, God, this stuff's really interesting. And it went from there. But actually, it does give me a chance to tell you a little story from today. So one of the main reasons I love curlews is because I grew up in the Severn Vale, or on the edge of the Cotswolds, and there were a few curlews kicking around in the sort of about 3 miles away from where I lived, a cycle ride away. So when I was a teenager getting into birding, they were like one of the highlights of the spring. Now, WWT, my employer, has a project trying to save the curlews of the Severn Vale, but they've retreated from the areas where I grew up. You don't get them anymore. You haven't had them there for 20, 25 years. This morning, got a WhatsApp message saying they've found a pair of curlews basically on the fields I used to watch them when I was 14. Haven't been seen there for 2 decades. Then they said, we've just read the colouring on this bird. It's a bird that WWT head started in Dartmoor 3 years ago. Nobody has a clue what it's doing. Nobody has a clue what it's doing in the Severn Vale, 3 miles from my birthplace. But it was a nice addition to my day. But yeah, and I think I guess the other thing I mentioned is literature has been hugely important to me in my sort of journey around nature, and I'd particularly highlight Laurie Lee, who came from the next door valley to me, and it's exactly what you say, Ralph. It's the detail. It's the fact that when he writes, he's actually seen it. He's not writing some generic nonsense. He's writing what he saw, and the ability to bring that to life in words. So if nothing else, guys, go and read Laurie Lee. Not necessarily seen as a nature writer, but it's astonishing.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we've sort of talked so much about the literature and cultural significance side of stuff. I think that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about curlews, and I think, as we said, they bring out huge emotion in people. And as Geoff has just said there, even those little stories, they make you smile. They're just really nice, and I think that's what kind of keeps conservation going. We're not in it for the statistics. We're in it for those little bits of emotion. Yes.
To be fair, Ellen, some of us do love a graph.
Okay, well, I do love a spreadsheet. In fairness. So one of the things that Curlew Action's founder, Mary Colwell, she talks about a lot is how curlews can be used as kind of a lens through which we can see kind of what's happening to the environment. And Matt, you kind of touched on that with them being an indicator species. Geoff, do you think that the decline of curlews is telling us anything about these wider environmental challenges?
Yeah, yes. I think, to me, what it's kind of saying is we've done this thing to the countryside, which, we delve into the details. They mow the grass too soon, blah 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 blah, all that stuff. But kind of hanging over it is we've industrialized it, and we when we drive through it, it doesn't look industrialized because it's still the same color, right? It's still green, but it's an industrial landscape now, and so industrialization, just like it does in towns and in factories and whatever, it simplifies, it homogenizes a landscape. So when you look at the grasslands of most of England now, and there are some lovely exceptions, they are dried, they're drained, they're flattened, they're fertilized, they're reseeded, and so what you're looking at is this contiguous sward. And what that does is leads to simplified ecosystems where suddenly the food base is way lower. There's much less insects in the landscape. We all know. We've all heard that stories. And the species that thrive there are a small number of really opportunistic generalists. And so that's why we're drowning in crows and foxes. These are animals that are very good at exploiting this kind of simplified system. But that's again, without getting into the detail, that's what's gone wrong for the curlew. Is it needs complexity. It needs sorry, it's a scientific word. It needs heterogeneity. It needs a mixture of dry and wet, and tall and short, and open and dense, and it needs that at some sort of reasonable spatial scale. And in most of our landscapes, we've taken that away.
Yeah. And I guess they're using so many of these different habitats, and if we're going to protect them, we need to protect all of these habitats, which does obviously make curlew conservation tricky. Are you do you disagree with that?
No, not disagree. I mean, it's a funny thing, curlews are not that specialist as well. No, that's wrong. They don't need a single habitat. There isn't an absolute prescription. You get them on heather moors, you get them on blanket bogs, you get them on wet grassland, you even get them on dry grassland in places like Salisbury Plain. They're not looking for this template, but what they are looking for is, I suppose, it's a template that they see but we don't necessarily, which is complex, insect rich, wet in places, not in other places, and that's what, you know, somehow we need to turn the dial on. And it's really hard because, you know, again, if you think about that, there's a reason why we've homogenized the landscape. It's because you make more money, you produce well, and you know, you make more food more easily if you're a farmer by, you know, making nice big square fields, and you know, it all looks the same. It's profitable, and that's not to criticize anyone, farmers or anyone else. That is just the way economies work, right? So it's quite a difficult thing to turn around, is to say we have to add mess, put back a bit of the mess, and I'm not an economist, so I don't know how you do that, because you are going against, you know, the way the world's economy is set up a little bit to do that. But on the other hand, I think, you know, the bright side of it is it's not complicated. It isn't complicated. Smash up a few field drains, you know, let things go to rack and ruin a little bit, you'll be fine.
I really love that. We need to add more mess. I think that's brilliant, because I really have this thing about this concept of ecological tidiness. And if anybody gets me ever talking about spraying pesticides in cities to remove the weeds, why do we do that? Why do we think that's messy? I think we need to change our ideas and add more mess. I really like that. Okay, so we talked about how curlews can be a lens to look at potentially what's happening in the landscape. Ralph, what about the way that we talk about nature sort of within the literature? Has that changed over time, and is that telling us anything?
One interesting example of this is mountains. So in the 17th century, mountains were terrifying and unpleasant, and you wanted to avoid them at all costs. They were seen as devilish and demonic. Whereas you move 100 years later, 200 years later, and suddenly they're sublime and they're full of God, and you can, you know, you climb Everest in order to meet your maker, and they're places of heroic struggle. And what that tells us is that the way we see nature and the way we describe it is very culturally determined and historically determined. So what you're just saying there, and I think it's just to follow on from what you're saying about tidiness and weeds and the simplified landscape, it's unbelievably coercive, this, isn't it? I don't know if any of you have ever been a messy gardener, but I have, and the neighbours come round and they grumble about it, and they say, you're lowering the value of the properties in the street. And I'm saying to them, well, I don't really want to pave over my front garden. You know, I'm going to dig a pond and I'm going to let the weeds grow. And they tut, and they, you know, I don't think this is particularly sort of suburban and horrid. I just think what that tells you is that we live within a very coercive aesthetic environment, and people look at a field, if it's left as rough grazing, they disapprove of it. And if you try and and that's some quite deep in them. You know, that's what we underestimate. People often say we've got to change the stories we tell in order to move things on. That's absolutely true. We have to change those stories. But what we forget is actually we live in these stories. They're not sort of separate from our consciousness, or separate from our decisions, or separate from our choices. They're absolutely fundamental to how we work. So when you say how does language, sorry, I lost the question, but language and nature, how does language my real worry at the moment is that we're caught in a set of with a kind of a shape, a pattern of language, a structure of language, which is based on a false aesthetic and a false understanding. And so we're unable to snap out of that and appreciate rough grazing, or we really have to jolt people into saying, no, that's don't just appreciate this, can change your whole vocabulary, change your whole way of thinking, which comes with that vocabulary, in order to address the climate crisis. People sometimes think that the cultural issues are sort of add-on, and it seems to me that it's not really. It's because the environmental crisis is in our narratives, it's in our heads, it's in how we understand our place in the world, it's how we understand history, it's how we think of ourselves as dominant, and colonial and all the rest of it. It's really profoundly important for us to kind of see this as in a deep way a cultural and linguistic problem. Rant over.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful. Rant away, it was great. Okay, so we need to change the way that we talk about stuff. Geoff was saying earlier that there's been a lot of awareness raising projects about curlews, but we're still sort of struggling to get chicks off the ground. Matt, do you think we need to change the way that, and I'm putting you on the spot here, do you think we need to change the way that we're talking about curlews and curlew conservation in order to translate that into chicks off the ground?
No, I don't think we do. I think actually we're all doing a wonderful job of talking about curlews and trying to get that message out there. And there's certainly a lot more noise than there was kind of 5 years ago or so on. Curlew are that hot topic of conservation. So I don't think we need to change the message. I think certainly we can widen or get that message out there further. And I think, again, like we talked about with school children and art and things like that, it's very important. But if I'm really kind of blunt with that, my daughters are 8 and soon to be 5 in a couple of weeks. So them drawing pictures of curlew and me taking them out and hearing curlew is wonderful. But specifically in Wales, them getting to the age where they might be able to do something about it 15 years time is probably too late. What I think really needs to be done quickly in Wales is, and the rest of the UK as well, is to put pressure on politicians and policymakers to appropriately fund habitat options and management options for farmers across the UK. I think that's really, really key. And obviously, as our different groups and Curlew Action and the CRP and Gilbert Cymru, we do that. But Geoff joked before and said, if you wanted to, you could grow bananas on the moon, and you could, and you can do all sorts of things if the money is there. And I've not met a farmer that says, well, if I was paid to do this crop sacrifice or do this or do that, I'd be able to do that. I would quite happily do that. So it's all about finding that balance. Obviously, there's food production within there, and we can't just get rid of all silage because obviously there's lots of cows that need to eat through the winter. And that's a completely, as I was saying before about difficult equations, that's a completely different equation in terms of food production and producing food more efficiently. I had a bit off topic, but I had a conversation with a lady in Wales not too long ago, and they were talking about strip grazing for their sheep, and they were saying they've got a choice with doing that because it's much more efficient than the way they were farming. They can either double their flock size or give kind of half of their farm over to conservation measures. And it's looking at things like that could be the potential route with this. But I think in the short term, to save curlew, we need to be looking at having more diverse habitats, better quality habitats, which comes from agri-environment schemes and so on, and the appropriate money from there, and then managing predators, reducing, and that's for lethal and non-lethal measures, reducing predation pressure. And I think the final kind of issue with all of that, which is really hard to solve, is silage cutting and reducing that. And that comes with crop sacrifice. And again, it comes down to money. So it's our ability to argue why money for conservation is just as important as other things. And I really can understand it from the politician side of things, where they're saying, well, I've got to put this money into different pots, and I've got to, we've got to put some money over to the NHS, and we've got to put some money over to policing and some money over to education. And then what are you left with really then for conservation? So this is why it's a really tricky thing, and I don't want to be too doom and gloom about it all, but we need to find ways of making wildlife, biodiversity, as we were talking about with ecosystem services, water quality, soil quality, all these things that humans need to survive. We need to actually properly value them. And I think that's really important going forward. So I probably went around the houses with an answer to that, but it's a difficult one. It really is.
No, that was a great answer, and I don't think it was doom and gloom. I think it was a really practical response of, okay, this is what we actually need to do if we're going to save these magnificent birds. And I want to make sure we've got time for questions, but Matt, actually, your answer led quite nicely into what was going to be my final question for Geoff. So as someone who has, to a certain extent, potentially, maybe, but hopefully not, sort of seen the extinction of a member of the Numenius, the Curlew family, what do you think we can learn from the decline of the slender-billed that might help us save the Eurasian curlew?
I guess the first point is, curlews are clearly vulnerable to extinction. So about 1% of the world's bird species have been lost in the last 500 years. A quarter of the world's curlew species have been lost in the last 50 years. So couldn't put my finger on what it is, but curlews are vulnerable, right? I mean, funnily enough, as we kind of touched on in the chat, the reasons why we lost Eskimo Curlew and Slender-billed Curlew are probably not the same as the reasons we are currently losing Eurasian Curlew. So there isn't a direct learning in that sense, in a sort of ecological sense, in a scientific sense. It's not like that. The analogy isn't quite there. One thing that might be there is the slippery slope, and the scientific word for this is the alley effect, which means that when a species gets to a certain level of rarity, it starts to become self-perpetuating. They can't find mates, that sort of thing. Their social signals break down because they don't have a society. That may well have happened to Eskimo and Slender-billed Curlew, because when they got super rare, they never recovered, and there possibly was a bit of an opportunity. I think we have to be really careful. I couldn't put my finger on what it is that makes them prone to this alley effect, this slippery slope effect. But I think we need to be really careful, because plenty of curlew populations are getting very small. I think more generally, the lessons for me with Slender-billed Curlew, the conservation world was unbelievably passive, and there's all sorts of good reasons for that. But we pretty much monitored it to extinction. You list the things that were actually done, not to count them or find them, but to fix them. But, well, there's nothing. We didn't do anything. And again, there's reasons, right? It was really difficult. We didn't know where they bred. But don't leave it too late, because by the time we were getting stuck in, like I said, they're quite. I mean, I don't know this, but there's a reasonable chance they went extinct while I was getting paid to study them, which is bonkers, right? It's absolutely mad. So I think, don't monitor things to extinction. And I think when we have these final conversations about if one gets found, are we going to fire a cannon net at it, catch it, stick a satellite tag on it, and possibly kill it? And to this day, the answer for me is absolutely bloody yes, because conservation is way too risk averse. And at that point, the logic was this, however tragic it would be, and however awful the last individual gets killed by some poor conservationist, and not worse for it, the bird or the conservationist. But it is better to go down fighting than go down sitting on your hands because you're worried about doing something that is negative. So I think basically, fight like buggery, start fighting early, and don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to try stuff. That's what I think we learn.
Geoff, you said so many things this evening that I think we need to put on a t-shirt. You're going to see them on the Curlew Action website. These are great. Thank you so much for that. That has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. All of your points have been really, really great. And I want to just look through the chat. There's been some really good conversation going on here. So I want to pull out some questions. And just because it's the one right in front of me, Mary has asked, Ralph, are we angry enough in our language in the face of extinctions? Is literature too soft and gentle rather than raging about the state of the planet?
Yeah, thank you, Mary. I was just actually typing a few thoughts about that. I mean, the short answer I think is yes. Actually, I think there's a public publishers' pressure on that. I think the publishers want. Nature writing has become very, very sort of generically recognisable and quite narrow. Although it's become diverse in its voices, it's nonetheless kind of comforting. And I know from many people who've written it, the publishers say, "Oh, but could you give us an upbeat ending?" They want that kind of hopeful ending. You find this in the novels as well, because there's this sense that gloom and doom won't sell, and so you have to sort of find some consolation at the end. I don't know. I wonder whether there's a kind of capacity to be angry about things which you think you can change. And if you feel you can't change it, then that kind of short circuits or disallows or prevents you from actually getting angry. And I think we've all slumped, or not all of us, but there's a kind of cultural feeling of, and I find this in my students, of passivity and, well, there's nothing I'm going to do, and probably things are going to get worse. And, you know, I can protest about Gaza, and I can protest about Black Lives Matter, and I can protest about trans issues, but this is too big to get angry about. It isn't, but I mean, I think that's at work in people sometimes.
Thank you for that. That was, yeah, I one of my, what I do outside of Curlew Action is I lead a youth campaigning group. It's called UK Youth for Nature, and I hear this a lot from young people who are really, really angry, but it's still trying to communicate that anger in a way that doesn't disempower other young people and make sure they still have agency. So trying to find that balance between being angry but also still keeping that motivation and that let's keep going because we can make a difference here is always a difficult one, and sometimes one that we're not always going to get right. I'm flicking through the rest of the chat. Lots of people saying thank you very much. Various people have mentioned No Mow May, which is a really great campaign. If anyone could see my lawn right now, you'd know that I'm participating in that. And it's not because my lawnmower is broken. It was a tactical decision. Mary or Megan, are there any questions in the chat that I've missed? I can see various of them have actually been answered throughout the webinar, which is great. If anybody has any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat.
Can I just ask a follow on to Ralph? Is there a distinction between doom and gloom and anger that is, I guess, that is useful to us?
Oh, absolutely. No, I was aware as I spoke, actually, that I was starting to sort of combine those two or mix them up a bit. I think one should avoid doom and gloom, and to some extent the sense that there's reason to hope, we need to provide hope and some possibility is really empowering. I think Mary's words were soft and gentle, and I think that the nature writing tradition has got a bit soft and gentle. But I also think Alan is right that being angry can switch people off. And how do you articulate anger in such a way as to make it land? I sometimes think this much maligned term NIMBYism is actually quite powerful. If people sort of say, look, this is my experience, which is being destroyed, and the anger which has grown up around the river pollution lately, and Fergal Sharkey going on, have I got news for you, and sort of just being furious at what's happened to the rivers. That's wonderful, isn't it? And I think, you know, Fergal Sharkey should be lauded for all the work he's done. But if you're angry about something which is personal, which you feel personally invested in, I think people get it, and it doesn't switch them off, and it makes them think, oh, I've got an equivalent here. Oh, yep, they trashed my park, or my river too. Yeah, so there's definitely room for it, and I think what Mary's pointing to is a problem in the literary culture, which is rather genteel and thinks that you should be respectable and decent and kind and polite and restrained in English, and all those things which you're meant to be, and not just go off the deep end. But I think it's time to go off the deep end with it.
Ellen, do you want us to answer Mary's challenge to us?
Yes, in one moment, and I've now just lost it. There was a question in the chat that, Geoff, I know you did actually answer, but it's probably worth sort of saying out loud. You mentioned there are various different specimens of both Slender-billed and Eskimo Curlews in museums. Do we know how many there are left in the world?
There was a little database of the Slender-bills in European museums when I was studying them. This was 15 years ago now, and there were about 200 odd. Yeah, it's scattered right across Europe and in some pretty obscure little regional museums as well as the big ones. And these are a few of them are on display. The vast majority are in a drawer. They're a scientific specimen. Eskimo Curlews don't know, because they went extinct moderately recently, and they were hunted, or at least after museums got invented and sort of natural history got invented. I would imagine there's quite a lot of Eskimo Curlews knocking around in America.
Thank you. And then do you want to have a go at Mary's question? And then just very, very quickly, and then we will wrap up. Actually, before you do that, just so that people have time, just to say, everybody, thank you very much for coming along to this webinar. Obviously, Curlew Action does put on these events for free, but they do cost the charity a little bit of money. So if you do feel like you're able to donate to support so that we can keep on putting on these events and carrying on this conversation about curlews, that we would really, really appreciate that. I have put the donation link in the chat. Sorry, Geoff, back over to you.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I would say I think probably my organisation is one of the better ones for incorporating art. The guy who set us up many years ago was an artist, amongst many other things. But I do take the point, and I think scared of isn't a bad way of putting it. I think some of it is most conservation organisations come essentially from scientists or that sort of world, natural historian, scientist. That's where they came from. That's where that's where their working culture comes from, I suppose, in many ways. And that probably does make us a bit afraid of the arts, because organizations have an internal culture, and there's an inertia around that culture, right? It's quite hard to change because it's the comfort zone of the people who work there. And I think the arts are not quite in our comfort zone. And I think it's a good challenge.
Matt, I think you're muted.
Don't go mute.
I was going to do it at some point. I was going to say, I would add to that. Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Geoff, with that. I think the type of people probably that work in the organisations that we work in are either the scientists and the data analysis kind of mindset, or are kind of more practically minded, want to get on with it from get it from A to B and get on with it from that side of things. And I think certainly, personally, I could incorporate the arts a lot more in. I mean, this has been a huge wake-up call, in honesty. Listening to Ralph, I was so impressed, moved by what Ralph was saying. I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and you can see how that moves people. And I don't think we do enough of it. We probably, I wouldn't say are afraid, but we don't think naturally about doing it, and that's the problem. We use competitions in artwork for schools and things like that with engagement, but we don't do enough of it. And like I was saying before, actually, if we were all to, instead of showing graphs all the time and talking about this and talking about that, if we were to use a bit of poetry or a bit of like I think Ralph was saying about the Merlin bird up before, and just how that bird song can get you more kind of involved in a species. I think all of that is so key going forward. And it's like I was saying before, so we do a bit of it, just showing a farmer a curly chick or a lapwing chick or so on. Just seeing that bird is often all the kind of motivation they need to keep going, but also all the thanks and gratitude and the value in it for them. The money almost can sometimes go out of the window when they see what they've kind of produced, if you like. So I definitely get it, but we need to act on it.
Yeah, I mean, that's where collaboration.
And just add to that, I think the arts should get closer to the science as well. I don't think this is a one-way street. I mean, that's one of my lessons from the Merlin app, is that there's a kind of discovery of how fascinating it is to identify things and to be a bit of a birder, a bit of somebody who's fascinated by botany, know the names of the plants, find out more about them. That's really changed my awareness, and I think that fits with the poetry, the art side. They're absolutely reciprocal, I think.
Yes, definitely. I think collaboration and us all working together from both sides, actively trying to build more collaboration, would be great for us and also for nature. Again, just want to say thank you so much to all three of you. This has been a really, really fascinating and a different conversation to the one I sort of envisioned, but it was so much better. It was, really, really, really interesting. So just thank you again. Thank you everybody for coming along. I think Megan has put in the chat the schedule for the rest of the webinars this year. I think the next one is on the 5th of June, and it's Curlews of the World. So we're going to be looking at some of the extant species, so the non-extinct species that we've still got around the world, which will be a really, really interesting discussion. So please do sign up for that one. And yes, that's everything. So yeah, just thank you again and have a lovely evening, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers. Bye.